The mountain winds carried the sound of crying across the Modoc settlement like a curse that would not break. For 3 days and 3 nights, the baby's screams had echoed from the small dwelling where Kinpwash lived alone with his infant son. The other families in the village had grown tired of the constant noise, and some had even moved their sleeping areas farther away from his home. Kinpwash was a proud man, known throughout the tribe for his skill with a bow and his knowledge of the old hunting grounds. But pride meant nothing when facing a hungry baby who refused to eat. His wife had died during childbirth, taking with her not only his heart but also the only source of milk his son would accept. The tribal medicine woman had tried everything she knew, from special herbs to ancient chants, but nothing could calm the crying child. The baby was growing weaker each day. His tiny face had become pale and his cries were getting softer, which worried Kinpwash even more than the loud screaming had. Other women in the tribe had tried to feed the child, but he would push away from every breast offered to him. It was as if the baby knew these women were not his mother, and he refused their help. Kinpwash had not slept properly in days. His eyes were red and swollen and his hands shook from exhaustion. He walked through the village carrying his son, hoping that the movement might soothe him, but nothing worked. The other men looked at him with pity, but none could offer real help. This was a problem that required a woman's touch, and the right woman had not yet been found. The tribal chief, an old man named Shanchin, finally approached Kinpwash on the 4th morning. The chief's face was lined with concern, not just for the baby but for the peace of the entire village. "My friend," Shanchin said, placing a weathered hand on Kinpwash's shoulder, "perhaps it is time to look beyond our own people for help." Kinpwash looked up sharply at this suggestion. The Modoc people were proud and independent. They solved their own problems and rarely asked outsiders for assistance. But as he looked down at his son's tiny, weakening form, he realized that pride might cost him the only family he had left. "What do you mean?" Kinpwash asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "There are others living near our lands," Shanchin explained. "White settlers have built homes along the river valley. Some have families and some have women who might be able to help your son." The idea of asking white people for help made Kinpwash's stomach turn. Relations between the Modoc and the white settlers were tense at best. There had been conflicts over land and water rights, and trust was scarce between the two groups. But as his baby let out another weak cry, Kinpwash felt his resistance crumbling. "I will not beg," he said firmly, "but I will ask." Shanchin nodded with understanding. "Take 2 other men with you. Make sure they know you come in peace, but also make sure they know you are not helpless." That afternoon, Kinpwash prepared for the journey to the settler community. He wrapped his son carefully in soft rabbit fur and placed him in a carrier that would keep him close to his chest. The baby's crying had become so constant that Kinpwash barely noticed it anymore, but he knew that the sound would announce their arrival long before they came into view. He chose 2 trusted friends to accompany him, Bogus Charlie, who spoke some English and could help with communication, and Hooker Jim, whose calm presence might help keep any situation from becoming dangerous. Both men understood the importance of this mission and agreed immediately when Kinpwash asked for their help. The 3 men set out as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. The journey to the nearest settler homestead would take most of the afternoon, and Kinpwash hoped they could find help before darkness fell. He had heard that white people were sometimes suspicious of Indians who approached their homes after dark. As they walked, Bogus Charlie tried to prepare Kinpwash for what they might encounter. "These people live differently than we do," he explained. "Their women dress in many layers of clothing, and they may be frightened when they hear the baby crying. We must be very careful to show them we mean no harm." Kinpwash nodded, but his mind was focused entirely on his son. The baby had stopped crying for short periods during the walk, but each time the silence lasted longer, Kinpwash grew more worried. He could feel the small body growing weaker against his chest, and he knew that time was running short. The first homestead they saw was a small log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. A garden had been planted nearby and chickens wandered freely in the yard. It looked peaceful and prosperous, exactly the kind of place where a family might have a nursing mother. But as they approached the house, a large dog began barking aggressively, and a man emerged from the cabin carrying a rifle. He shouted something in English that Bogus Charlie quickly translated. "He wants to know what we want and why we're here." Kinpwash stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. He gestured to the baby carrier and spoke a few words in his limited English. "Baby hungry. Need help." The man's expression softened slightly when he heard the infant's weak cries, but he did not lower his weapon. His wife appeared in the doorway behind him, and Kinpwash could see her straining to hear what was happening. Bogus Charlie stepped forward and began explaining the situation in more detail. He told the couple about Kinpwash's wife dying in childbirth and about the baby's refusal to accept milk from the Modoc women. He explained that they had come seeking help, not to cause trouble. The woman whispered something to her husband, and after a moment of consideration, the man lowered his rifle. But then he shook his head and spoke again. Bogus Charlie's face fell as he translated. "She says she is sorry, but she has no milk to give. Her own baby died last winter and she cannot help us." Kinpwash felt his heart sink, but he nodded respectfully and thanked the couple for their honesty. As they turned to leave, the woman called out again. She pointed down the valley toward another homestead and spoke quickly to Bogus Charlie. "She says there is another family about 2 miles from here." Bogus Charlie translated with renewed hope. "They have a servant girl who recently had a baby. The woman thinks she might be able to help us." With this new direction, the 3 men continued their journey, carrying with them the fragile hope that somewhere ahead, a stranger might hold the key to saving Kinpwash's son. The second homestead was larger than the first, with a well-built house surrounded by fields of corn and wheat. Cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, and the whole property showed signs of prosperity and hard work. As the 3 Modoc men approached, they could see smoke rising from multiple chimneys, suggesting that several people lived there. Kinpwash's son had grown alarmingly quiet during the walk, and now the baby's breathing seemed shallow and irregular. Every few minutes, Kinpwash would stop and check to make sure his child was still alive. The fear that he might be too late grew stronger with each step. A middle-aged white man emerged from the barn as they approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the calloused hands of someone who worked the land every day. Unlike the previous homeowner, this man did not immediately reach for a weapon. When he saw the 3 Indians approaching his property, "Good afternoon," the man called out in a voice that was cautious but not hostile. "What brings you men to my land?" Bogus Charlie stepped forward and began explaining their situation. He spoke slowly and clearly, describing how Kinpwash's wife had died and how the baby was refusing food from all the Modoc women. The farmer listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the bundle in Kinpwash's arms where weak cries could still be heard. "That's a tough situation," the farmer said when Bogus Charlie finished speaking. "I'm Samuel Morrison, and this is my property. I wish I could help you, but my wife and I have no young children and there's no nursing mother in our household." Kinpwash's heart began to sink again, but then Morrison continued speaking. "However, we do have a young woman working for us who recently had a child of her own. Her name is Mary, and she's been helping my wife with household duties since her baby was born about 2 months ago." Hope flickered in Kinpwash's chest as Morrison gestured toward a smaller building behind the main house. "She lives in the servants' quarters with her infant. I should warn you, though, that she's had a difficult time recently. Her husband abandoned her when he learned she was expecting, and she's been struggling to make ends meet." Morrison paused and looked directly at Kinpwash. "She's a good woman who's fallen on hard times. If she agrees to help you, I hope you'll treat her with respect." Kinpwash nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of this man's words. Through Bogus Charlie, he assured Morrison that he meant no harm to anyone, and that he would be grateful for any help the woman might offer. Morrison led them across the yard to the small cabin where Mary lived. As they walked, he explained more about her situation. "Mary came to us about 4 months ago, heavily pregnant, and with nowhere else to go. She'd been working as a seamstress in town, but when her condition became obvious, she lost her job. People can be cruel to unmarried mothers." The farmer's wife, a kind-looking woman with graying hair, had come out of the main house and was following them. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Morrison and explained that Mary had become like a daughter to her during the months she had lived on their property. "She's proud, though," Elizabeth warned. "She doesn't like accepting charity, and she works harder than anyone should have to prove her worth. When you speak to her, remember that she's been hurt by people who should have helped her." They reached the small cabin, and Morrison knocked gently on the door. "Mary, there are some visitors here who need to speak with you. They have a baby who needs help." The door opened slowly, and a young woman appeared. Mary looked to be about 20 years old, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, and wearing a dress that had been mended several times. She was clearly tired, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but her face showed strength and determination despite her difficult circumstances. In her arms, she held her own baby, a healthy-looking infant with chubby cheeks and bright eyes. The contrast between her thriving child and Kinpwash's weakening son was immediately apparent to everyone present. "What's this about?" Mary asked, looking curiously at the three Modoc men. Elizabeth Morrison stepped forward and gently explained the situation. She described how Kinpwash's wife had died in childbirth and how the baby had been refusing food for days. As she spoke, Mary's expression changed from curiosity to concern, and she looked more closely at the bundle in Kinpwash's arms. "May I see the baby?" Mary asked softly. Kinpwash carefully unwrapped his son and held him so Mary could see. The infant's face was pale and drawn, and his tiny body seemed fragile in his father's large hands. When Mary saw the child's condition, her own baby seemed to sense the seriousness of the moment and became quiet. "Oh, you poor little thing," Mary whispered, reaching out to gently touch the baby's forehead. At her touch, Kinpwash's son opened his eyes for the first time in hours and looked directly at her. "How long has he been like this?" Mary asked. Bogus Charlie translated the question, and Kinpwash responded with obvious pain in his voice. "4 days since he has taken any milk," Bogus Charlie translated. "The tribal women have tried to feed him, but he will not accept their milk." Mary looked at her own healthy baby and then back at the dying child in Kinpwash's arms. The decision she was facing was clear to everyone present. She had barely enough resources to care for her own child, and taking on the responsibility of feeding another baby would mean sacrifice and hardship for both her and her own infant. "If I help this baby," Mary said slowly, "it means I'll have less milk for my own child, and I don't know if I can produce enough for both of them." Elizabeth Morrison placed a supportive hand on Mary's shoulder. "I'll make sure you get extra food to help with milk production," she said. "And if you need anything else, Samuel and I will help however we can." Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking back and forth between the two babies. Her own child was healthy and strong, while Kinpwash's son was clearly close to death. The moral weight of the decision was enormous, but as she looked into Kinpwash's desperate eyes, she saw a father's love that transcended all differences of race and culture. "I have some milk prepared," Mary said finally. "Let me try feeding him first, and we'll see if he'll take it from me." She disappeared into her cabin and returned a moment later with a small cup and a cloth. She had expressed some of her milk and was ready to attempt feeding the baby. Kinpwash handed his son to her with trembling hands, and everyone present held their breath as Mary brought the cloth to the baby's lips. At first, nothing happened. The infant was so weak that he barely seemed to register the presence of the milk. But Mary was patient, gently encouraging him and speaking in soft, soothing tones. Gradually, the baby began to respond, and after several tense minutes, he began to drink. The relief on Kinpwash's face was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in days, his son was taking nourishment, and there was hope that the child might survive. But as Mary continued feeding the baby, everyone realized that this was just the beginning of what would need to be a much longer arrangement. "He'll need regular feeding for weeks, maybe months," Mary said, looking up at Kinpwash. "This isn't something that can be solved with just one meal." The implications of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Saving this baby would require a commitment that would change the lives of everyone involved, and the path forward was far from certain. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as everyone worked to prepare for Mary's move to the trapper's cabin. Samuel Morrison had ridden out at dawn to inspect the old building and had returned with encouraging news. The cabin was structurally sound, with a good roof and a functioning fireplace, though it would need cleaning and some basic repairs. Elizabeth Morrison had spent the early hours gathering supplies that Mary would need. She packed blankets, cooking utensils, preserved foods, and extra clothing for both babies. She also included medical supplies and herbs that might be useful if either child became ill during their stay in the cabin. Mary spent her time expressing extra milk and preparing bottles that could be used for emergency feedings. She had learned from experience that babies sometimes refuse to eat directly from the breast, and having alternatives available could prevent dangerous situations. Kinpuash had returned to his tribal settlement overnight to inform the chief about the arrangement and to gather his own supplies. He brought back hunting equipment, tools for making repairs to the cabin, and several items of Modoc craftsmanship that he wanted to share with Mary as tokens of his appreciation. When the group reconvened at the Morrison farm, they found that Mary had carefully organized everything needed for the journey. She had fashioned a carrier that would allow her to transport both babies safely, and she had packed her personal belongings in a way that would make settling into the cabin as efficient as possible. "I've been thinking about this arrangement all night," Mary told Elizabeth Morrison as they loaded supplies onto a wagon. "I'm nervous about living alone in the wilderness, but I'm also excited about having a real purpose for the first time in months." Elizabeth smiled warmly at the younger woman. "You've been surviving on your own since your husband left, Mary. Taking care of these babies won't be harder than what you've already been through, and at least now you'll have help and support from both our family and Kinpuash." The journey to the trapper's cabin took most of the morning. Samuel Morrison drove the wagon loaded with supplies, while Mary rode beside him holding both babies. Kinpuash and his two companions walked alongside the wagon, occasionally taking turns carrying one of the infants when Mary needed to rest her arms. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a stream running nearby that would provide fresh water. It was isolated but peaceful, and the natural beauty of the location helped ease some of Mary's anxiety about living there. The building itself was larger than Mary had expected, with 2 rooms and a loft area that could be used for storage. The main room contained a stone fireplace and a sturdy wooden table, while the smaller room had obviously been used as a bedroom by the previous occupant. Samuel Morrison and Kinpuash worked together to make immediate repairs and improvements to the cabin. They replaced some loose boards, cleaned out the fireplace, and set up a secure area where Mary could safely keep both babies while she worked on other tasks. Elizabeth Morrison and Mary focused on organizing the living space and creating a comfortable environment for caring for the infants. They set up sleeping areas for both babies near the fireplace where the temperature would be warmest, and they arranged the cooking and medical supplies in easily accessible locations. As the day progressed, it became clear that the arrangement was going to work better than anyone had hoped. Kinpuash's son continued to feed successfully from Mary, and his strength was obviously returning with each meal. Mary's own baby seemed to enjoy the new environment and was untroubled by sharing his mother's attention with another infant. By late afternoon, the cabin was ready for occupation. Samuel and Elizabeth Morrison prepared to return to their farm, while Kinpuash set up a camp about 100 yards away, where he could stay close enough to help but far enough away to give Mary privacy and independence. "Remember," Elizabeth Morrison told Mary as she prepared to leave, "Samuel will come to check on you every 3 days. If you need anything sooner than that, send a message with Kinpuash and we'll come immediately." Mary nodded, though she was clearly nervous about the moment when she would be left alone with the 2 babies. She had never lived by herself in such an isolated location, and the responsibility of caring for both infants felt overwhelming. Kinpuash seemed to sense her anxiety, and he approached her with his son in his arms. Through Bogus Charlie, he spoke to her about his own fears and uncertainties when he had first become a father. He says that all parents are frightened when they realize how much their children depend on them, Bogus Charlie translated, but he also says that Mary has already proven she can handle difficult situations by surviving on her own and making a good life for her baby. These words of encouragement seemed to give Mary more confidence, and she accepted Kinpuash's son for another feeding with steady hands and a calm demeanor. As the baby ate, she spoke softly to him, and it was clear that a bond was already forming between them. "What should I call him?" Mary asked suddenly. "I can't keep thinking of him as the baby or Kinpuash's son. He needs a name that I can use when I'm caring for him." Kinpuash spoke at length in his native language, and Bogus Charlie translated his response. "In our tradition, a child receives his name when he shows what kind of person he will become. This baby has shown that he is a fighter who refuses to give up, even when things seem hopeless. Kintpuash suggests calling him Strong Heart until he is old enough for his formal naming ceremony. Mary smiled at this suggestion. Strong Heart, she repeated. Yes, that fits him perfectly. He certainly has the heart of a fighter. As the sun began to set, the Morrison family and Bogus Charlie and Hooker Jim prepared to leave the cabin. The moment of separation was emotional for everyone involved, as they all understood that the next few weeks would be challenging and uncertain. Take care of yourself, Mary, Elizabeth Morrison said, embracing the younger woman warmly. You're doing something wonderful and we're all proud of you. Kintpuash approached Mary and spoke directly to her, even though she couldn't understand his words. His tone was serious and respectful, and when he finished speaking, he placed his hand briefly on her shoulder in a gesture of gratitude and respect. He's thanking you for saving his son's life, Bogus Charlie translated, and he's promising to protect you and your baby as if they were his own family. After the others had left, Mary found herself alone in the cabin with 2 sleeping babies and the weight of her new responsibilities. The silence was both peaceful and intimidating, and she spent several minutes simply listening to the sounds of the forest around her new home. Kintpuash's campfire was visible through the window, a reassuring reminder that she wasn't completely alone in the wilderness. The knowledge that he was nearby, ready to help if needed, gave her the confidence to settle in for her first night as a surrogate mother to Strong Heart. As she prepared the babies for sleep, Mary reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a struggling single mother with an uncertain future. Tonight, she was a vital part of saving a child's life and building a bridge between 2 very different cultures. The challenges ahead were real and significant, but for the first time in months, Mary felt that her life had genuine purpose and meaning. She was no longer just surviving. She was making a difference in the world, and that knowledge filled her with a sense of peace and determination that she hadn't felt since before her husband had abandoned her. The baby drank slowly but steadily, and with each swallow, color began to return to his tiny face. Mary held him carefully, supporting his head with practiced ease while murmuring gentle words of encouragement. It was clear that she had natural instincts for caring for children, and her own baby watched quietly from where Elizabeth Morrison now held him. As the immediate crisis of getting the baby to eat was resolved, the larger questions began to emerge. Kintpuash knew that his son would need regular feedings for many weeks to come, but he lived in a Modoc settlement that was several hours' walk from the Morrison farm. The practical challenges of this arrangement seemed almost impossible to overcome. This baby will need to eat every few hours, day and night, Mary explained through Bogus Charlie's translation. In his weakened state, he can't go long periods without milk or he'll become sick again. Kintpuash nodded his understanding, but the worry on his face was obvious. He had already been away from his own responsibilities in the tribe for most of the day, and he couldn't simply abandon his duties to stay near the Morrison farm indefinitely. Samuel Morrison, who had been quietly observing the situation, stepped forward with a suggestion. There's an old trapper's cabin about halfway between here and your settlement, he said. It's been empty for years, but it's still in decent condition. If Mary was willing to stay there with both babies, it might work as a temporary solution. Everyone turned to look at Mary, whose expression showed she was carefully considering this possibility. The idea of leaving the relative safety and comfort of the Morrison farm to live alone in an isolated cabin was daunting, especially with 2 infants to care for. I don't know, Mary said hesitantly. I've never lived alone in the wilderness, and what if something happens to one of the babies? Or what if dangerous animals come around? Elizabeth Morrison moved closer to Mary and spoke in a reassuring tone. You wouldn't be completely alone. Samuel could check on you every few days, and if Kintpuash is staying nearby, he could help protect you. Kintpuash understood enough of the conversation to realize they were discussing where Mary might stay to continue feeding his son. Through Bogus Charlie, he assured Mary that he would camp near the cabin and would be available to help with hunting, gathering firewood, and protecting her from any dangers. But what about payment? Mary asked, addressing the practical concerns that nobody else had mentioned. I can't afford to live without earning money, and caring for 2 babies would be a full-time job. This question brought an uncomfortable silence to the group. Mary was already struggling financially, and asking her to take on additional responsibilities without compensation seemed unfair. but Kintpuash had little to offer in terms of money, as the Modoc people operated mostly through bartering and trading rather than using currency. Kintpuash spoke quietly to Bogus Charlie, who then addressed the group. Kintpuash says he is a skilled hunter and knows where to find the best game in these mountains. He offers to provide meat for Mary and the Morrison family in exchange for her help with his son. Samuel Morrison nodded approvingly at this suggestion. Fresh game would be valuable, especially with winter coming on. And if Kintpuash knows the hunting grounds well, he might be able to provide more meat than we could get on our own. Mary looked around at the faces surrounding her, all waiting for her decision. The baby in her arms had fallen asleep after feeding, his breathing now steady and peaceful. Her own child was contentedly gurgling in Elizabeth Morrison's arms, unaware of the life-changing decision being made around him. "What about supplies?" Mary asked. "The cabin would need to be cleaned and prepared, and I'd need food, blankets, and other necessities for caring for 2 babies." Elizabeth Morrison immediately volunteered to help with these preparations. "I can gather everything you'll need," she said. "Blankets, clothes for the babies, cooking supplies, and enough food to last several weeks. Samuel and I have been blessed with prosperity, and it feels right to share it with someone in need." The generosity of the Morrison family was touching, but Mary still seemed uncertain. She had learned through hard experience that depending on others often led to disappointment, and the idea of living in an isolated cabin with 2 babies was frightening. Kintpuash, sensing Mary's hesitation, did something unexpected. He carefully took his son back from Mary's arms and then, with great ceremony, removed a beautiful beaded necklace that he wore around his neck. The necklace was clearly valuable, made with intricate patterns and colored beads that would have taken many hours to create. He held the necklace out to Mary and spoke in his native language. Bogus Charlie translated, "This necklace belonged to his wife. It was made by his wife's mother and given to her on their wedding day. Kintpuash says that if Mary helps save his son, she will have a place of honor in his family forever, and this necklace will represent that bond." Mary took the necklace with trembling hands, understanding the significance of what Kintpuash was offering. This wasn't just payment for services. It was an adoption into a family, a promise of permanent connection and mutual support. "He's offering more than just trade goods," Elizabeth Morrison said softly. "He's offering you a place where you belong." Mary looked down at the necklace, then at her own baby, and finally at Kintpuash's son, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The decision she was facing would affect not just her own life, but the lives of both children and their future relationship with each other. "How long would this arrangement last?" Mary asked. Bogus Charlie translated the question to Kintpuash, who responded thoughtfully. "Until the baby can eat other foods besides milk," came the translation. "Perhaps 4 or 5 months, depending on how quickly he grows strong." Mary was quiet for several minutes, weighing all the factors in her mind. Finally, she looked up at Kintpuash and nodded. "I'll do it," she said. "But we need to start preparing immediately. This baby needs consistent care and we can't afford any delays." The relief that washed over Kintpuash's face was immediately visible to everyone present. He spoke rapidly in his native language, and though the others couldn't understand his words, his gratitude was unmistakable. "He says Mary will be remembered in Modoc songs for her kindness," Bogus Charlie translated, "and he promises that his people will always consider her a friend." As the sun began to set over the Morrison farm, the group began making plans for the days ahead. There was much to be done before Mary could move to the trapper's cabin, and every detail needed to be carefully considered to ensure the safety and health of both babies. But for the first time since his son's birth, Kintpuash felt genuine hope. A stranger had opened her heart to his child, and that act of compassion had created possibilities that he never could have imagined. The road ahead would be challenging, but it was a road that led toward life rather than death, and that made all the difference in the world. The first week in the cabin passed more smoothly than Mary had dared to hope. Strongheart continued to grow stronger with each feeding, and his appetite was increasing daily. Mary's own baby, whom she had named Thomas, seemed to thrive in the peaceful forest environment and was sleeping better than he had since his birth. Kintpuash proved to be an invaluable helper and protector. Each morning he would bring fresh water from the stream and firewood for the fireplace. He was also an excellent hunter, providing rabbit, deer, and fish that supplemented the preserved foods Elizabeth Morrison had packed. Most importantly, his presence gave Mary a sense of security that allowed her to focus entirely on caring for the babies. Communication between Mary and Kinpuash remained limited, but they were gradually learning to understand each other through gestures, simple words, and shared experiences. Kinpuash had picked up a few English words during his interactions with white settlers, and Mary was beginning to recognize some basic Modoc phrases that Kinpuash used when talking to Strongheart. On the fourth day, Samuel Morrison arrived for his first scheduled visit. He was pleased to find everyone healthy and the arrangement working well. He brought news from town and additional supplies, including fresh vegetables from Elizabeth's garden and news that the community was talking about the unusual cooperation between the Modoc man and the white woman. Some people in town are curious about what's happening up here, Samuel told Mary. Most are just interested in the story, but a few are concerned about a white woman living alone with an Indian so close by. Mary felt a flash of irritation at this news. Kinpuash has been nothing but respectful and helpful, she said firmly. Anyone who has a problem with our arrangement doesn't understand the situation. Samuel nodded approvingly at her response. That's exactly what Elizabeth and I told them. We explained that you're doing something noble, and that Kinpuash is a man of honor who's just trying to save his son's life. During Samuel's visit, Kinpuash demonstrated his skill as a hunter by bringing back a large deer that would provide meat for several weeks. He also showed Samuel some of the improvements he had made around the cabin, including a better water collection system and a small garden area where Mary could grow vegetables if she decided to stay longer. He's thinking ahead, Samuel observed. This man is planning for the long term, which suggests he really does see this as a permanent arrangement that will benefit everyone involved. When Samuel left the next morning, he carried messages from Mary to Elizabeth and a small beaded bracelet that Kinpuash had made for Elizabeth as a thank you gift. He also took some of Mary's sewing work back to town, where Elizabeth would try to find customers who might want to purchase items made by the woman who was caring for the Modoc baby. As the days passed, Mary began to develop deep affection for Strongheart. She found herself looking forward to his feeding times and enjoying the way he responded to her voice and touch. The baby was clearly thriving under her care, gaining weight and becoming more alert and active each day. One evening, as Mary was feeding Strongheart by the firelight, she noticed that Thomas was watching the process with great interest. Her own son seemed fascinated by the other baby, and would often reach out to touch Strongheart's tiny hands when they were lying near each other. I think Thomas enjoys having a little brother, Mary said aloud, speaking to Kinpuash even though she knew he couldn't understand most of her words. To her surprise, Kinpuash nodded and responded in English. Brothers, he said, pointing to both babies. Good for both. This simple exchange represented a breakthrough in their communication, and from that point forward their conversations became more frequent and meaningful. Kinpuash began teaching Mary words in his language while she helped him improve his English. These language lessons often took place while they worked together, on tasks around the cabin or while caring for the babies. Mary learned that Kinpuash had been married to his wife for 3 years before she became pregnant, and that her death had left him devastated and alone among his people. While the Modoc community had supported him, no one had been able to solve the problem of feeding his son, and he had begun to fear that he would lose the only connection he had left to his beloved wife. In return, Mary shared her own story of betrayal and abandonment. She told Kinpuash about how her husband had seemed loving and supportive until he learned she was pregnant, and how he had disappeared one night without even saying goodbye. She described the shame and isolation she had felt as an unwed mother, and how the Morrison family had been the first people to treat her with genuine kindness and respect. These conversations created a bond between Mary and Kinpuash that went beyond their shared responsibility for Strongheart. They discovered that despite their different backgrounds and cultures, they had both experienced loss and betrayal, and they both understood the determination required to survive difficult circumstances. As Strongheart grew stronger and more alert, he began to show distinct preferences and personality traits. He was clearly a curious baby who enjoyed being talked to and held, and he seemed equally comfortable with both Mary and Kinpuash. Most remarkably, he appeared to recognize that he had 2 different caregivers and would respond differently to each of them. With Mary, Strongheart was calm and content, accepting his feedings peacefully and often falling asleep in her arms. With Kinpwash, the baby was more active and playful, seeming to enjoy the different tone of his father's voice and the way Kinpwash would sing traditional Modoc songs to him. Thomas, meanwhile, was developing his own relationship with both Kinpwash and Strongheart. Kinpwash had begun including Thomas in his daily activities, carrying him while he worked around the cabin, and teaching him simple words in the Modoc language. Thomas seemed to enjoy these interactions and would often laugh and babble when Kinpwash spoke to him. One morning, Mary woke to find Kinpwash sitting by the fireplace with both babies in his arms, singing softly in his native language. The scene was so peaceful and natural that Mary remained still for several minutes, watching this man who had become such an important part of her life, caring for both children as if they were equally his own. When Kinpwash noticed that Mary was awake, he smiled and gestured for her to join them by the fire. As she settled beside him, he continued his song, and Mary found herself humming along with the melody even though she didn't understand the words. "What is the song about?" Mary asked when Kinpwash finished singing. "Family," Kinpwash replied in his improving English. "Song about how family is not just blood. Family is people who care for each other and protect each other." Mary nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of his words. Over the past weeks, the four of them had indeed become a family, united not by blood or marriage, but by shared responsibility, mutual respect, and growing affection. As she looked at the two babies in Kinpwash's arms, Mary realized that her life had been forever changed by this experience. She was no longer just a struggling single mother trying to survive on her own. She had become part of something larger and more meaningful, and she could no longer imagine her future without including Kinpwash and Strongheart in it. The arrangement that had begun as a temporary solution to save a baby's life was evolving into something much more significant and lasting, and Mary was beginning to understand that some of the most important relationships in life develop in the most unexpected ways. 3 months had passed since Mary first agreed to help feed Strongheart, and the transformation in everyone's lives was remarkable. The baby had grown into a healthy, laughing child who was beginning to eat solid foods in addition to Mary's milk. Thomas had also thrived in the forest environment, becoming more active and social than he had ever been before. Mary and Kinpwash had developed a partnership that extended far beyond caring for the babies. They had learned to communicate effectively in a mixture of English and Modoc words, and they worked together on all aspects of maintaining their temporary household. Mary had become skilled at preparing wild game and plant foods that Kinpwash gathered, while he had learned to help with washing clothes and other domestic tasks. The relationship between them had also deepened into something neither had expected when the arrangement began. They had discovered that they shared similar values about family, hard work, and loyalty, and they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Neither had spoken directly about these growing feelings, but both were aware that their connection had become much more than a practical partnership. Samuel, Morrison's regular visits, had brought news from the outside world that made their isolated life seem even more precious. Tensions between white settlers and various Indian tribes were increasing throughout the region, and there had been several violent confrontations in recent months. The peaceful cooperation between Mary and Kinpwash stood in stark contrast to the hostility and mistrust that characterized most interactions between their two peoples. "You two have created something special here," Samuel told them during one of his visits. "In a time when most whites and Indians can barely speak to each other without reaching for weapons, you've built a family together. That's not something that should be taken lightly." Elizabeth Morrison had also become deeply invested in the success of the arrangement. She had been selling Mary's sewing work in town and saving the money for Mary's future use. More importantly, she had been defending Mary and Kinpwash against critics who questioned the wisdom of their living situation. "People in town are starting to understand that this isn't just about feeding a baby," Elizabeth told Mary. "They're beginning to see it as an example of how different peoples can work together when they focus on what's important rather than on their prejudices." As Strongheart became less dependent on Mary's milk, the question of what would happen next became more pressing. The original arrangement had been intended to last only until the baby could survive without nursing, and that time was rapidly approaching. However, None of the four people involved in the situation seemed eager to return to their previous lives. Kintpuash had been visiting his tribal settlement regularly to maintain his connections and responsibilities there, but he had also been exploring the possibility of building a more permanent home near the cabin. He had spoken with Chief Shanshan about the situation, and had received the chief's blessing to continue living apart from the main settlement, if that seemed best for his son's welfare. Mary, meanwhile, had been struggling with the knowledge that her time caring for Strongheart was coming to an end. She had grown to love the baby as much as her own son, and the thought of separating from him was painful. She had also come to depend on Kintpuash's presence and support in ways that she hadn't fully realized until she imagined life without him. The question of their future together came to a head during a conversation on a warm autumn evening. Both babies were sleeping peacefully, and Mary and Kintpuash were sitting by the fire, enjoying the quiet companionship that had become such an important part of their daily routine. "Strongheart will not need milk much longer," Kintpuash said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Mary nodded, though the subject was one she had been trying to avoid thinking about. "He's getting stronger every day. Soon he'll be able to eat the same foods as Thomas." "What happens then?" Kintpuash asked directly. Mary looked at him across the firelight, seeing in his face the same uncertainty and hope that she felt in her own heart. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I can't imagine going back to the way things were before, but I also don't know what other options we have." Kintpuash was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully in his improving English. "In my people's tradition, when someone saves a child's life, they become part of that child's family forever. You have saved Strongheart, so you are his second mother now, not just someone who helped for a while." Mary felt her heart racing as she understood the implications of what Kintpuash was saying. "Are you asking me to stay permanently?" she asked. "I am asking if you want to build a life together," Kintpuash replied. "Not just for the babies, but for us. I have come to care for you and Thomas as much as I care for Strongheart. We have become a family, and I don't want that to end." Mary looked at this man who had brought such unexpected meaning into her life. 3 months ago, she had been a desperate single mother with no prospects and no hope for the future. Now she was being offered the chance to be part of a loving family with a man who respected her strength and valued her contributions. "What would that look like?" Mary asked. "We come from very different worlds, and people on both sides might not accept our choice." Kintpuash nodded, acknowledging the challenges they would face. "Some people will not understand, but the people who matter most already support us. Chief Shanshan has said that any woman who saves a Modoc child is welcome among our people. The Morrison family treats you like their own daughter. We have friends who will help us." Mary considered the practical aspects of what Kintpuash was proposing. Where would we live? How would we support ourselves? "I can build us a good house near here," Kintpuash said. "I know these mountains well, and I can provide meat and fish for our family. You can continue your sewing work, and the Morrison family will help us trade with people in town. We can make a good life together." The vision that Kintpuash painted was appealing, but Mary needed to be certain that this decision was based on genuine love rather than just gratitude and convenience. "Kintpuash," she said seriously, "I need to know that you're asking me this because you truly want to share your life with me, not just because I helped save Strongheart." Kintpuash moved closer to Mary and took her hands in his. "Mary," he said, using her name with the careful pronunciation he had practiced, "you have given me back my hope for the future. Not just because you saved my son, but because you showed me that it's possible to trust and care for someone again. I want to wake up every morning knowing that you and both our boys are safe and happy." Mary felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard the sincerity in Kintpuash's voice. She had never expected to find love again after her husband's betrayal, and she certainly hadn't expected to find it with someone from such a different background, but the feelings she had developed for Kintpuash were real and deep, and the life he was offering seemed like a dream come true. "Yes," Mary said simply. "Yes, I want to build a life with you." Kintpuash smiled and leaned forward to embrace Mary gently. As they held each other by the firelight, both babies stirred in their sleep as if sensing the significance of the moment. Strongheart and Thomas were no longer just two infants who happened to be cared for in the same place. They were brothers in every sense that mattered, with parents who had chosen to create a family based on love, respect, and shared commitment. The journey that had begun with a desperate father seeking help for his dying son had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. Mary and Kinpwash had found not only a solution to their immediate problems but also a path toward a future filled with hope, love, and the knowledge that some of life's greatest blessings come from the most unexpected sources. Their story would be told for generations in both the Modoc tribe and the white settler community, as an example of how love and compassion can bridge any divide and create families that transcend the boundaries of race and culture.